Today's bonus episode features my full discussion with Professor Robert S. Levine, an author and professor of English at the University of Maryland. If you've listened to this week's episodes, you're certainly familiar with his voice. In 2021, Professor Levine released his book, The Failed Promise: Reconstruction, Frederick Douglass, and the Impeachment of Andrew Johnson. The Failed Promise is an excellent read, and I suggest it to anyone who's interested in learning more about the era and hearing more of Professor Levine's analysis. In addition to The Failed Promise, Robert Levine has written a few other works on Frederick Douglass and this era, and you can find all of those on his site, www.blog.umd.edu/Robert-S-Levine. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you enjoy listening to it.
Hi, Lincoln. I am Robert Levine. I'm Distinguished University Professor of English at the University of Maryland, and I have a recent book on the impeachment of Andrew Johnson that looks closely at the role of Frederick Douglass and other Black activists.
Okay, so getting right into it, starting out with Andrew Johnson. If you could give kind of an overview of who Andrew Johnson was, what was he like as a person, as a politician, and kind of a couple of the reasons why Lincoln might have chosen him to be VP.
Yeah, so Andrew Johnson is an interesting figure. Right now, he is regarded as one of the very worst presidents that we ever had. He has a very bad reputation. I actually think he was an interesting political figure for a while. So he's a politician in Tennessee. He was working class. He started out as a tailor. He started out with small political jobs. By the late 1850s, he became senator from Tennessee. What's really interesting about him for a Southerner is that he was opposed to the secession. He thought the South had done wrong by leaving the Union. He referred to Jefferson Davis and others as traitors. Around 1862, he declared that slavery should be abolished. This is also kind of unusual for a Southern politician. And Andrew Johnson himself, during the 1850s, had a few house slaves in Tennessee. So he had bought into the slavery system. Lincoln found him appealing because he was a Southerner who was opposed to the secession and opposed to slavery. He named him military governor of Tennessee. And when Lincoln was up for re-election in 1864, Lincoln and others thought that Andrew Johnson might help him win what they feared would be a close election by offering some sectional balance. So Lincoln's vice president, Hamlin Hill, was from Maine, and they thought that Johnson would really help them. And I think that Johnson and Lincoln shared a lot in the way they viewed the Civil War and the way they viewed slavery. And then when Johnson becomes president, things start to change.
Right. Of course, when Johnson is becoming president, he has to work with the different senators and different figures in Reconstruction, like Douglass. So if you could explain kind of what that relationship was like between the radical Republicans, and then if you want to go separately with how that was with Douglass, and then kind of how they evolved over time.
Right. So when Johnson became president, most of the radical Republicans thought he would be a great president because he had this history of opposing the Confederacy and coming out against slavery. Johnson met with people like Charles Sumner in the first month when he was president. Charles Sumner was convinced that Johnson would do everything he wanted, which included giving Black people, former enslaved people, the right to vote. May 29th, 1865, Andrew Johnson issues an amnesty proclamation in which he's basically saying, I'm not going to talk about the Southerners as having seceded, and I'm not going to worry about former Confederates being part of state or national government. And the radical Republicans felt betrayed. So you have about a 1 month period when things seem to be going well. Then you have this amnesty proclamation. And then it takes about 6 months before the radicals really turn on Johnson. So when people talk about what was happening with Johnson, why the sudden switch when he seemed so promising, it's really hard to say. My feeling is that he really identified with the South ultimately, that he felt uncomfortable with the Northern radical Republicans, that he was a contentious figure and he kind of enjoyed contention. And what everyone else says is that he was racist and that his racism was guiding his policy. So what's again kind of interesting there is in the first year that Johnson was president, he had regular meetings with Black people at the White House. He seemed to be on their side. Something I talk about in my book is that in 1864, when he was military governor of Tennessee, he declared before hundreds of Black people in Nashville that slavery was over in Tennessee. He was not legally sanctioned to make that statement, but he did. And Black people in Tennessee started referring to him as their Moses, kind of as a Moses of Black people. So you have this figure of Johnson as very popular among some of the radicals, among Black people, including, I think, Frederick Douglass. And then things started to change. So by the end of 1865, there's a sense of betrayal. And you can see that everywhere. You can see that in African-American newspapers, such as the Christian Recorder, which was the newspaper of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and a really significant cultural organ. They liked Johnson for the first 6 months or so. Then they start seeing him as a person who betrayed them. And the radical Republicans realize that they're going to have to formulate their own policies without the help of Johnson. So by the time you get into 1866, when the radicals have a majority in Congress, they're able to to override Johnson's vetoes of their various Reconstruction legislation. So things become very contentious by late 1865, early 1866. As it seems to me, Johnson pivots back to having sympathies for the South, and as Johnson's racism becomes more of a determining factor.
Right.
And if you want me to talk about Frederick Douglass specifically for a minute, I'd be happy to do that.
Definitely, yeah.
So Frederick Douglass is one of the first Black people to turn against Andrew Johnson, and he does that in a speech of September 1865. Up to that time, Black newspapers are okay with Johnson. They see him as promising. 1866, first week in February, Frederick Douglass meets with Andrew Johnson in the White House. And this is something I have a whole chapter about in my book, The Failed Promise. The idea was that Douglass would go there with about 10 other Black people and make the case for Blacks' right to vote. And Andrew Johnson thought he would just kind of lecture them about his beliefs and they would just listen to him. And Douglass wouldn't let that happen. And Johnson, during the course of the meeting, reveals his clear racism. He even says that Blacks should consider immigrating, which was taken as, Blacks should leave the United States. And the kind of cool thing about this for me as a literary scholar is that Andrew Johnson brought to this meeting a stenographer who was very skilled in shorthand, had developed his own shorthand method. And that night, the entire discussion appeared in a Washington, D.C. newspaper. And then it was reprinted in newspapers throughout the country and in African-American newspapers. And suddenly, particularly in abolitionist and African-American newspapers, people were saying, this Andrew Johnson is horrible. And Douglass, in his 1881 autobiography, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, said that he believed that this meeting was crucial to the way that, let's say, the Northeast, I was going to say the nation, let's say the Northeast began to rethink who Johnson was. And what I argue in my book is that Douglass deliberately tried to get on Johnson's nerves, that this was kind of performance art on the part of Douglass, and that he succeeded. He drew Johnson out, and suddenly there's a revelation that this is who this person is. It's almost kind of like having a Confederate in office. And the relationship doesn't end there. I mean, there's this weird, surprising story that Douglass gives these well-known lectures, speeches attacking Johnson. And in late 1866, early 1867, published 2 essays attacking Andrew Johnson in the Atlantic magazine, which was this high prestige journal coming out of Boston. In the summer of 1867, Andrew Johnson offered Frederick Douglass a job in his administration. And I have a whole chapter on that in my book as well. And I think he was trying to shut him up, like somehow get him into the administration, shut him up. And the job offer was made secretly so that if Douglass turned it down, Johnson would not be embarrassed. Douglass turned it down, and he turned it down in a newspaper, a New York newspaper, because he wanted to publicize that he was not going to be co-opted by this person. So a lot of people, blacks, whites, radicals, thought Johnson was promising, and then he proved not to be promising. The title of my book is The Failed Promise. And I'm basically referring to the failed promise of Reconstruction, but I'm also thinking about the failed promise of Andrew Johnson, because he was an anti-slavery, pro-union Southerner who then suddenly seemed to reveal himself as a Confederate type.
Right. Regarding kind of specifically Black Americans, how do you think that they viewed Reconstruction generally? And Johnson, I know you covered some of this already, but was there anything kind of more direct about that?
Yeah. I mean, first thing I'd warn against is there isn't a single Black American view. And Black Americans have different circumstances, different situations. So you have Frederick Douglass, who is meeting regularly with Black activists in Black conventions in places like Syracuse and actually throughout the Northeast. These are all well-educated Black people who are either freeborn or who had escaped from slavery prior to the Civil War. And they all wanted the Civil War to bring about Black citizenship and Black voting rights. Then you have a couple million free people in the South, many of whom were illiterate. And probably they would have loved citizenship and the right to vote. And when they got the right to vote, they did. But they were looking for education. They were looking for job opportunities. They probably weren't thinking about national politics in the way of someone like Frederick Douglass or Martin Delany. And they were highly dependent on the Freedmen's Bureau, which was the agency set up by Congress to help the freed people in the South. So there were these offices and bureaus throughout the South, and they offered legal advice, employment advice, advice on how to vote eventually. But a lot of these people, the several million people who were free people, were just trying to get by day in a very racist environment. And a lot of them ended up working on plantations for pay and kind of for not pay, because they would have to pay for the property and for the food that they would get when they were doing that kind of work. So you have millions of Black people who are struggling. You have Black activists like Douglass who are calling for full rights of citizenship.
Right. And all of this kind of culminated into the impeachment of Johnson. So if you could kind of briefly give an overview of the impeachment of, if you'd like, so maybe Douglass's view to that,
right.
And also some of the evolutions within just that period of impeachment.
Yeah. I mean, there was talk about impeaching Andrew Johnson from the time he became president. So even when he was vice president, because he seemed to be drunk on the day that he was inaugurated as vice president. As the radicals got angry with him, they would keep coming up with these little measures to try to impeach him. Meanwhile, in March of 1867, which was a year before the impeachment, Congress passed something called the Tenure of Office Act, which made it illegal and even impeachable for a president to remove a person from the cabinet who had been approved by the Senate. And eventually, the impeachment came about because Andrew Johnson fired Edwin Stanton, who was Secretary of War, and that was a violation of the Tenure of Office Act. So in a way, it was kind of like a trick, in a way, a kind of trick. Like, it's very difficult to impeach a president that you don't agree with. But if they actually break the law, and that was the law, then you can impeach them. So the impeachment trial that took place from, I think it's March into June or May, let me just think, let's just say into the spring of 1868, was all about the Tenure of Office Act. What had happened there? Did he fire him? When did he fire him? Was there justification? So what was really frustrating to Frederick Douglass and other Black people is that Andrew Johnson was not being impeached for his rejection or his stubborn refusal to go along with measures of Reconstruction. And so the material that's out there that you can find, Frederick Douglass's son, Charles, attended the impeachment trial. Douglass didn't, for reasons I could talk about, but the son did, and he wrote him letters about what was happening. And Charles's position is that Johnson was responsible for the death of African Americans, that racist anger led to violence. And he should be impeached for that and for resisting Black voting rights and all that kind of thing. I think that's what Douglass believed as well. One Black newspaper complained that Johnson was being impeached over, and I'm going to quote, legal quibbles, end quote, not for fundamentally rejecting Reconstruction. In the end, Johnson was not convicted, and he fell and the Republicans fell one vote short of getting him convicted. And I think there were probably some backdoor maneuverings that kept him in power, but that the Republicans probably felt that he was now kind of under their control. He just had a few more months left in office. They wanted Ulysses S. Grant to become president, which is what happened. If he had been convicted, someone else would have become president, not Grant. So the Republicans didn't want that. Douglas, after the trial, wrote a series of essays saying, saying a couple things. The first is that this guy should have been convicted. And the second thing is that he thought the whole process was absurd, of focusing on something like the Tenure of Office Act. So he wanted to remind Americans of what the issues were. And until he died in 1896, Douglas kept bringing up Andrew Johnson and the whole specter of a nation that's rejecting Reconstruction and is kind of living with racism and keeping Blacks from their full rights as citizens. So 1868 sees the passage of the 14th Amendment, which gives citizenship rights to Black men. 1870 sees the passage of the 15th Amendment that gives voting rights to Black men. By the middle of the 1870s, it was almost impossible for a Black man to vote in the South because of violence. And so everything fell apart by the mid 1870s or so. People talk about Reconstruction ending, say in the late 1870s, maybe 1880s. But by the 1890s, there's an upsurge of lynchings of Black people. And there's a Supreme Court case, Plessy v. Ferguson, that institutionalizes separate but equal, in other words, segregation, until the 1950s, when Brown v. Board of Education tried to remedy that. So from Douglas's point of view, the impeachment trial avoided the big issues. I don't know the role that Wilson played in that trial, but that's something worth thinking about. Was he obsessed with the Tenure of Office Act, or was he interested in talking about, you could say, Johnson's other crimes? The Chief Justice, who was watching over the trial, was named Salmon Chase, and anytime people strayed from the Tenure of Office Act, he told them they were out of order. And Douglas and his son both blamed Chase in part for the failure of the conviction. There was a man named Benjamin Butler, who was also based from Massachusetts, who attempted to articulate what the real issues were. And when he did that at the trial, Chase first told him he was out of order, and second, he stopped the trial, put it off for the next day, because he just didn't want to deal with some of these larger issues that weren't, in fact, part of the articles of impeachment. There were 11 articles of impeachment. Some touch on things other than the Tenure of Office Act, but most of them just talk about the Tenure of Office Act, and that his crime was firing Edwin Stanton. So if you want to kind of phrase that differently, his crime was doing something bad to a white man, whereas the trial should have been something about race, except I think the Republicans were concerned that most white Americans were racist and that they would not. And so pragmatically, let's go for the Tenure of Office Act, because if you made the whole trial about race, would that really interest white people in Ohio, for example, or even Massachusetts?
Right. It's certainly one of the most interesting things to look at in Reconstruction, all the different players of impeachment itself and the different viewpoints. Mm-hmm. Wilson was more hesitant to support impeachment, especially in the early days when people wanted to just impeach him for his, racist policies and his vetoes. Wilson was very against that, but as time went on, he became more open to it. He did vote in favor of it, but myself.
Right. But by voting in favor, he's voting in favor of getting rid of him because of violating the Tenure of Office Act, which was firing a white man. You probably know that the complete transcript of the trial is available online.
Yes.
You could do a search and find what Wilson, is he part of the trial? Is he one of the managers?
No, he wasn't a manager.
Okay.
From what I've read, and one of the biographers of Wilson who I've spoken to was somewhat unclear on this too. From what we've kind of interpreted is that he wasn't publicly endorsing the impeachment, although towards the end it seems that he was kind of course, swayed and convinced to go along with it. So it's unclear. I'm sure if I did a deep dive on the transcript, I would find something in reference to Wilson. That's what I come to find, is that the deeper I look in things, the more I find pieces of Wilson. So my final kind of wrapping it up question, and it's the question that I've asked everyone that I've spoken to so far, was before I reached out to you, had you ever heard of Wilson? Had you ever come across something referencing Wilson?
Or maybe not again. I'm an English professor. I've heard of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville. When I got involved with the impeachment, I focused on the big leading players like Charles Sumner, like Thaddeus Stevens. To be honest, the name sounded familiar because I've read through a lot of the transcript, but I don't know much about him at all. I did a quick read of Wikipedia to prepare myself for this interview. I look forward to your podcast so I can learn more about him.
Of course. No, I appreciate that. There was, you did quote him in the early chapters of your book.
Interesting.
So I was.
What is it? What did I quote? Just remind me.
Oh, I wish I had a copy in front of me. It was something in regards to, I think, Lincoln's. It was, I think you quoted Sumner and then with Wilson. I'm sure it's indexed.
So this is what Wilson, is he turning against Lincoln?
It might have just been in speculation of Lincoln. He never.
Yeah, I mean, I have 3 references to Wilson. He's huge in my book.
Yeah.
Wilson's initially wanted Johnson to resign because he was drunk.
Right.
The second inaugural.
Yes.
So that's one thing.
Yeah. I know because there was a lot of Sumner, and Wilson and Sumner were, of course, close because of their.
Yeah, and then Wilson is the person who is there for the July 4th, 1865 celebration, which is an interesting moment because that's when Andrew Johnson allows Black people to come to the White House and congregate. And this is before people start turning on him. And Wilson is saying he's going to be a great president. He's behind Black people.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess I should have looked at my index too. And then let me just see one other thing here. And then, I just refer to him as greeting Johnson warmly when Johnson returns in 1874, I think it is, as a senator, and then dies a few months later.
Right.
Yeah, so Wilson's there.
Yeah. But that's what I've asked even historians, and the basic most common answer I get is, well, I had to look him up on Wikipedia and read his.
Right.
So don't feel left out of that, not being a historian and all. But thank you so much again. And if you have any questions for me, I'll reach out, and definitely thank you for that email about Well.
Okay, sure. Okay.
Yeah.
So happy holiday. Take care.
Yes, you too. Have a good one.